Hello, this is your host, Lewis, of the Praise of Flight podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to subscribe to my locals where you can support the channel directly and interact with the channel directly. And tonight we are going to discuss the Siege of Gondor, episode 5 in our Decisive Battles of Middle-earth series. So as a prelude, we will look at Sauron on June the 20th of the Third Age, 3018, tested the resolve of Gondor by an assault on Osgiliath. Finding it strong, he built up his strength for a major assault the next year, and we already covered the battles of Osgiliath in detail last week. On March the 6th of the Third Age, Aragorn looked into the Palantir of Orthanc to draw Sauron out. Sauron ordered the attack on Gondor on March 9th of the Third Age, 3019. Gandalf and Pippin arrived in Minas Tirith. The garrison was reinforced by men from Morthond under the command of Duhnir and his sons Dulian and Derufin with 500 bowmen, and Falas, an assortment of farmers, shepherds, and hunters. They were scantily equipped, except for their lord Galasgil from Lamadon. A few doughty hillmen with their lord arrived. 100 fisher folk from Ether, 300 green-clad men under Hurlin, the fair of the Green Hills, from Pinoth Gelin, and then Imrahil, prince of Dalamroth, with a full company of knights, with 700 men-at-arms, tall, dark-haired, and gray-eyed, which was less than a tenth of what was needed. March the 10th of the Third Age, 3019, Gandalf saved Faramir from the Nazgul. Osgiliath was taken on March 11th. Faramir retreated to the Ramos Echor, which was taken. March the 13th, Faramir, wounded, returned to the city. He was rescued by Prince Imrahil of Dalamroth. But before the gates were shut, the refugees from Anorian said they had heard no news of Rohan, and that if Rohan could come, it would be too late. They also said that men from the east bearing axes and in the appearance the dwarves were marching. See who's here. Euthanasia, Minoan, Zero World, and M. Hello, all. So the battle itself lasts 2 days, March 13th to March the 14th of Third Age, 3019. In preparation for the siege, all the land was burnt, the trees were burnt, and the bodies of men living or dead were mutilated. The darkness hid the number of troops. Tents of red and black were pitched for the hordes of Mordor. The orcs dug deep trenches in a huge ring around the city. Just outside of bowshot, the trenches were filled with fire, whether natural or some art of Sauron, none could tell. As the trench was completed, the onlooking defenders could see large wagons approaching, likely to provide provender for the men and orcs and missiles for the catapults. Catapults were set up behind the trench to fire into the city. Because they're firing over the walls, these are likely onagers and mangonels rather than a ballista. And technically catapult means shield piercer, which is a ballista. But I think what Tolkien means here is the one with the lever arm, where when you cut the rope, it flings the rock over the walls, which execute plunging fire. At first, the men on the walls laughed at these weapons, not understanding their purpose. The walls of Gondor were made in the same fashion as the Tower of Orthanc, so very robust. Even the Ents couldn't dent the stone of Orthanc when they attacked it. Only some convulsions of earth could destroy it. Some men boasted Minas Tirith would not fall if men lived. Others said, if we live. They feared hunger would destroy them. The catapults threw over what appeared to be grenades. They burst into flame and lit the lower levels on fire. This drew men from the walls to put out the fire. Second volley from the catapult struck not at the city itself, but the morale of the men. Decapitated heads, horribly mutilated from the heads of men killed in the defense of Osgiliath and the Ramos. The moral battle was raised to a new level when the Nazgul, flying on their fell beasts under the single will of the Witch King, shrieked their cries above the city and out of bowshot. They wore down the hearts and resolve of even the stoutest men. Many dropped their weapons in terror and fell to the ground, and thought only of hiding and crawling away. Denethor, mourning the perceived death of Faramir and attempting to end his life in a funeral pyre, one for himself and one for Faramir, commanded the city devolved to Gandalf. Gandalf and Prince Imrahil rode all along the line of defense, Gandalf from citadel to gate to inspire the men. When these two were present, the men forgot their fears, but when absent, their fears returned. Many men were cut off from retreat at their posts. Many fled to the second gate. The great bridge was built over the Anduin, and great siege towers built in Osgiliath crossed over for the assault. Great battalions of orcs passed through secret passes in the trenches to assault the walls. Gondor had too few archers to take advantage of the orcs illuminated by the fire behind them. The orcs cared not for losses, and the men of Gondor had already been sapped of courage by the Nazgul. Pippin leaves to warn Gandalf of Denethor's plan. He convinces Baragon to stand at arms to defend Faramir by letting no man enter and obey the now mad Denethor's orders. The assault raged on until midnight. Great Mumakil from Harad approached the walls, pulling siege towers and catapults in their train. Even though many of these beasts died, the Witch King cared not. They were there merely to pin all along the wall the men of Gondor to their posts. The fires and drumbeats rose to a fever pitch. The great ram Grond was unleashed. Forged in Mordor, it was like a giant tree 100 feet long, with a large steel head in the shape of a wolf. Spells of ruin were woven about it. Grond was named for the mace of Morgoth, the first Dark Lord. Great beasts, Tolkien does not specify what they are, possibly Mumakil, drew it. It was guarded by battalions of orcs and wielded by mountain trolls. The mouth of the gate was choked with fire, wrecked towers, and dead orcs. Grond moved on, no fire could burn its housing. No matter how many beasts were slain or wounded, more came to replace them. The Witch King, riding on horse, approached and held out his sword. The defenders let their weapons drop to their sides and failed to launch a single missile in anger. Fear was cast on both men and orc. The Witch King spoke in a long-forgotten tongue that rent heart and stone. He cried 3 times, and the ram boomed 3 times. The final stroke was as if an explosion of flame took place and shattered the gate. The Witch King was the first foe to cross the gate entrance, but none more would come. He was illuminated by the fires behind him, dark and menacing. Only Gandalf and only Shadowfax could bear the sight of him. Gandalf ordered him to withdraw. The Witch King challenged Gandalf and then drew his sword, which was lit into flame. Then a cock crew, bringing on the dawn, and the horns of Rohan, beginning the signal of aid, finally arrived. And there ends the siege of Gondor. The aftermath. The Battle of Pelennor Fields begins. The defenders would likely not have held out long against the forces arrayed against them by Sauron, as many as possibly 60,000 orcs and men with siege weapons. The city would have been a bloody battle to take. It had 7 layers of defense, 7 walls up the mountainside, but could have been taken in time if no aid arrived at Gondor. Okay, and then Tolkien again shows knowledge of warfare, in this case, siege warfare. The only mistake Sauron made was not defending the entrance to the woods controlled by the wild men, for they were thought impassable. The alleged impassability of locations has brought many armies to woe. So if we look at this here, there's a lot of interesting things we can look at. So the first thing is we can definitely see again Tolkien's understanding of morale and fear and getting at somebody by getting at their will to fight, rather than say, just killing them outright. It's more effective to get them to not want to fight in order to do this. So the first thing I want to say is the idea of throwing a decapitated head at someone, especially if someone you expect the defenders to know, is a very effective demoralizing tool. So after the Battle of Mataras in 207 BC, when the Romans, after defeating Hasdrubal, Hannibal's brother, they cut off his head and then tossed it into Hannibal's camp later that year. And at that point, Hannibal knew it was pretty much over. But that's a very effective way to break the morale of somebody while you're attacking them. The other thing is the bursting fire thrown by the catapults is the same kind of thing that Saruman used in his siege of Hornburg. Because it's interesting, there's also recorded that an explosion was there with Grond when it broke down the Great Gate of Gondor. Now, the question is, though, I think with Grond, it's pretty well implied that there was some sort of magic involved. The Witch King is issuing an incantation. But so that seems to be different than, say, the flaming grenades fired by the catapults, and then what Saruman used. What Saruman used seems to be similar to these grenades, which are then, thrown over the wall into the fire to start a fire. And that's another effective way to pull men off the walls, right? By starting fires, which then causes them to go put it out. And we see the same strategy that Saruman used when he had the ladders thrown up all along the wall of the Hornburg in order to pin everybody down so he could attack the weak spot, which was the culvert. And here we see Sauron doing the same thing. He has towers and Mumakil, and they're all rolling up to attack the walls in order to pin all the troops down so that they could finally wheel up Grond to destroy the main gate. Now, he mentions that the housing of the ram was unable to be caught on fire. Now, it could be due to magic, because we're assuming that the Witch King is casting spells and doing stuff like that. But it's also possible that if you have like a carriage and you cover it like in hides that are soaked in water, like they're not going to burn. And if you have animal hides like nailed all over this thing and they're soaked, they're not going to burn. So it could be magic, but it doesn't have to be. And it's not clear which way Tolkien intends us to read that. Probably magic, because it's associated with the Witch King, and we know that Grond itself had spells of ruin on it. So that's likely a possibility. The other thing that's interesting too is notice the difference in siege techniques, right? Saruman has some kind of blasting powder. He has a small ram, and he's got ladders. Sauron has Grond, siege towers, catapults. He's definitely operating on another level than Saruman. He's got a lot more resources. In all likelihood, the catapults in Grond were built by men, not orcs. Not elves, because it's not like Morgoth where he had elves in tow. These are probably built by men, evil men, and so under the guidance of like the Witch King or something. And that shows that there's a higher level of, for lack of a better word, capitalization that Sauron has that, say, Saruman didn't. Saruman could only have little wimpy battering rams and ladders rather than this whole panoply that he has. And it's interesting too that Tolkien makes mention, of course, of the wagons that he brought to the battle, most likely to provide provender for the men and the orcs, and missiles for the catapults, which shows that he understands implicitly the logistical needs of the siege. Right? He doesn't spend a lot of time talking about it. It's not very interesting, but at least he gives that a nod. The other thing that Tolkien does is he shows the importance of famine. Right? The men, the garrison are like, oh well, Sauron could just starve us out because we're going to be cut off from food. The other thing too that is not known by anybody here at the moment because they're stuck in the city, but all the reinforcements they expected from like the Lamroth and Lebanon and elsewhere were not sent because of fear of the pirates of Umbar. So this broader siege, the broader grand strategic vision at this point is that Sauron is also threatening from the south. And so because of that, in the lead up to the siege, reinforcements don't come, or at least not nearly as many as expected, because they had expected more. And the troops that were at Har Andros that were defeated by a host that had marched out of the Black Gate, as opposed to Minas Morgul. And those two forces meet up and cross over at Osgiliath. So at that point, we see that Sauron has bridged the river so he can bring over his heavy weapons. Presumably the Mumakil also crossed on the bridge, unless they were just large enough to wade the river themselves. And then also, it's interesting that he would mention again the Axemen as a sort of like shock troop, because if you remember back when we discussed the Battle of the Fords at the Eisen, the Orcmen and the Uruk-hai had axes as well. So I think Tolkien is using that as a sort of indication these are like shock troops. And then the reason why shock troops would be using axes is because axes are a very effective weapon at cutting through armor. Because what they do is, because the blade at the axe, blade is narrow, but the axe head is heavy. So you have a lot of this energy that you can swing and then bring to a small point. Whereas a spearhead has a small point, but not a lot of mass. And a sword has a lot of mass, but its blade is long. So the penetrating power against metal is diminished. So axes are great for being shock troops to get through to that. And I also think it's interesting that there's a lot of historical examples where people thought a area was impassable. In fact, it wasn't. Most famously, of course, the German panzer divisions in the Ardennes in 1940, but also Dorchester Heights, the British didn't think that it could be taken. Washington puts artillery up there overlooking New York, and they withdraw because it's an indefensible position at this point. And in the Mexican War, under Winfield Scott, Robert E. Lee, who was an engineer for the U.S. Army at the time, went through, I think they were dried up lava fields on the way to Mexico City, which again were considered impassable. Well, nothing is ever really impassable. That seems to be the real issue here. I mean, I guess in an absolute sense, some things are impassable, but for these purposes, though, not necessarily. The other thing is we see that with the use of Mumakil, at least at this stage, right? Because later on they'll make an appearance in the Battle of Pelennor Fields, but they're used to move the siege towers, and that's why I think it's hypothetically possible that whatever these strange beasts were, unless there's something completely without precedent in the Lord of the Rings, they're possibly Mumakil. In which case, you could see that. So there's the built-in fear factor. I did a video on elephants for the History of Warfare stream, and yeah, all the ancient sources agree that elephants were terrifying on the battlefield. And so, one of the things that you see is Tolkien understands this, and we'll get into more detail with this level of fear factor in the Battle of Pelennor Fields. But I think also that he understands the importance of just morale, the sense of, breaking a man's will to fight before the fight even begins. Because that's in part how the battle proceeded so quickly in the favor of Sauron, breaking down the gate with Grond, and then also, approaching the walls with siege towers. Is the Nazgul, the decapitated heads, setting the lower levels on fire. It really just won him that engagement before it even started. Of course, what Sauron doesn't understand, isn't aware of, is all the other things that are transpiring at the moment, which of course I'll get to when we get to Pelennor Fields. The other thing too is that inspirited leadership on the defense, right? So Gandalf and Prince Imrahil are able to, quote unquote, punch above their weight, keeping the men in the fight. Right. I think it was Wellington that once said Napoleon was like worth 10,000 men. That's the kind of issue. It's men like that who can inspire other men are worth far more than themselves. And well, certainly Gandalf and Prince Imrahil were going up against the Nazgul, which would even outmaster. Well, it wouldn't outmaster Gandalf, but would outmaster the other men that they were trying to rally. It shows that he does understand that proper guidance, by spirited leadership on the defense can still shore up, a quaking heart. And also, of course, the Nazgul can fly. So Sauron also has the advantage of aerial attacks. And I mentioned in the Battle of the Five Armies, when the eagles show up, they drive away the vampire bats and start attacking the goblins directly. And the sort of aerial supremacy, even if it's not fully exploited to its full potential, because again, how could these mythical creatures be quite as effective as bombers? They can still create this threat presence that if the enemy has control of the skies, even to a limited degree, it does create this credible threat that people are like, oh yeah, it's like, this is bad. This is real bad. Now, had reinforcements not come for the Gondorians, Gondor had 7 levels. So theoretically, you're not going to be able to take Grond up the rest of those levels. It's too big. It would have been a bloody slog for the forces of Mordor. But coupled with, fear and hunger, they probably would have still won. And in fact, even after the Battle of Pelennor Fields, Gandalf insinuates as much, that no victory on the battlefield can assure success. The real success can only come by the destroying of the ring. But again, the siege of Gondor, which was relatively well conceived, was again still premature because Aragorn baited out Sauron in the first place. And of course, as we all know, Aragorn goes to the Paths of the Dead to then summon the Dead Army, to then beat the pirates, to then bring reinforcements to Pelennor Fields. But it's almost like, so this is sort of like what you get with like Greg Boyd's idea of the OODA loop, where you get inside the decision-making process. And so Aragorn gets inside Sauron's decision-making process by making him think that he has the ring. And that ties into Sun Tzu, all war is deception. So Aragorn is deceiving Sauron, who's in turn deceiving Denethor. And it's playing this game of cat and mouse to outwit and outsmart the other side in order to achieve victory. Now, of course, the good guys here are just playing for time. They're not. They know that they can't necessarily win on the battlefield. The other thing that hurts the defense of Gondor is that they don't have very many bowmen. That's another thing. Of the reinforcements, only 500 were bowmen, and I don't think we're told how many were there in the city before, which would have been necessary to defend the walls effectively. But even the bowmen that they did have are rendered ineffective by the psychological warfare of the Nazgul, terrifying and scaring people with their shrieks, cries, and magic. And so the other interesting thing is the Ramos Ekor, while much longer out in the Pelennor, there wasn't enough manpower to defend it, much like Helm's Dyke. A lot of these advanced defenses would need a much stronger garrison to defend because of their length, and it wasn't long enough for them to do. And possibly there were things Gondor could have done to delay Sauron before the attack, such as, for example, even though the Pelennor Fields itself was indefensible, Denethor could have easily, dug pits, had pits dug rather, and then placed spikes in them, or developed or thrown caltrops, which are basically like small metal devices that have 4 prongs, and with 3 of them on the ground and one's always pointing up to step on the feet of the orcs men and the Oliphants. And also, one of the things that happened during the Civil War was you would have logs that were trimmed down and then sharp iron spikes placed in, or sharp wooden stakes placed into them, sort of like wooden barbed wire, which I suppose could have been done given the technology constraints of the day for Middle Earth. But again, I think the main point, like with Denethor and Theoden and Wormtongue, is that through the Palantir, Sauron was sapping Denethor of any will. So Denethor wasn't really competent or able to organize an effective defense against Sauron. And that's the real issue here. That's the real point. So it's not just that Sauron and Saruman are powerful and evil. They're very intelligent. They know how to sort of pave the way for victory. They pave the way by attempting to weaken the resolve of their enemy's leadership by using, and Sauron is more able to do this than Saruman, but using like terror tactics to terrify even the troops in the field, which again does work up to a limited point. But like with Helm's Deep, and when we later get to Pelennor Fields, it's the case that with Sauron, there's things he doesn't expect. And it's these things that he doesn't expect, like Rohan showing up, and Rohan moving through the wild men's woods. And then certainly Aragorn taking out the pirates. He doesn't expect that at all. And that's ultimately what brings him down here. Also, Gandalf says later on that had Sauron kept all of his troops in Mordor rather than unleashing them for an assault, Frodo could never have found Mount Doom, and the quest would have been lost. But because he attacked Dale, Lothlorien, and Gondor all at the same time, 2 things. One, he didn't win. If he'd have sent everything against Gondor, he'd have easily won, at least on that front. And then 2, by emptying Mordor, because he couldn't imagine them trying to destroy the ring, he didn't have any scouts or spies to find Frodo. And so this sort of misstep is, part of Sauron's overweening pride. But also, too, Tolkien understands siege warfare, right? Typically what you do is, this is something you saw a bit later in the Age of the Star Forts, but you dig trenches in front of the city to encircle it, and then you would dig trenches towards it, as you could creep closer without getting shot at directly. And one of the reasons, so again, I think I mentioned this in an earlier video, digging a trench around a city is called the wall, it's called circumambulation. And that's in order to cut it off from supply, which is what Sauron did to Gondor, with the only area not being cut off that would be the Wildmen's Forest, because he believed it was impassable. And then behind that, he has the catapult set up. He lights fires. I think the reason why he lights fires is for intimidation purposes, because obviously it's going to backlight any attacking forces, which would make them easy marks. If Gondor had enough forces to actually shoot them with like either catapults of their own or bowmen. But he didn't. Or rather, Gondor didn't. And so there were passes within the trenches that could be crossed. I mean, to be honest, it's quite likely Sauron just would have used wooden planks. Just throw them down over the trench and men can cross it. Now, maybe if Mumakil can't cross it, in which case maybe you would have to have a secret pass. And then attacking all along the front to keep the enemy pinned while you attack the weak spot. So this is basically the same kind of tactics and strategy that Saruman used against the Hornburg, but on a larger scale against a larger city with more complicated weapon systems, because Sauron was better capitalized. He had siege towers rather than siege ladders. He had catapults, of which Saruman had none. He seemed to have similar blasting powder, and he had Grond. And so, all in all, the Siege of Gondor is a very large part of The Lord of the Rings, but it does illustrate, again, Tolkien's level of knowledge with regards to, in this case, siege warfare. Let's see what we have in the chat. Vingel. Well, you're here at least. Minnow, the elephant episode is excellent. Thank you. War just isn't war without the war elephants, right? It's still impressive he could imagine air power in future warfare. That is interesting. Violinist Williams made it. Well, I'm glad you made it. Yeah, Tolkien, yeah. Interesting. Yeah, it's really interesting because when you have a fantasy setting, you don't really have airplanes or bombers, but you have like mythical creatures that can fly. Dragons, phoenixes, griffins, eagles, rocks, and of course the fell beast of the Nazgul. And so, how do you incorporate that into a kind of like warfare setting? And I think Tolkien does it in a very creative way. So let's see. What's this? Youth in Asia. It's still impressive he can imagine air power in future warfare. Tolkien. Vingel. Warfare was happening in the air before he wrote Lord of the Rings, though. Youth in Asia. I don't think planes were particularly used heavily in World War I, were they? Well, at the end of World War I, they were used heavily, especially in the 1918 offensive by the Allies. Youth in Asia, or at least in combined arms method. Vingel. Not heavily, mostly reconnaissance, granted. He started writing Lord of the Rings before World War II. His son Christopher was a pilot in that war. Forged Warhammer. Tolkien was influenced by the First World War and the Somme, though. Let's see. What were the Manoa? What were the wild men? Well, in the chapter "The Ride of the Rohirrim" in the Return of the King, the Rohirrim go through a forest with which is the habitation of a group of wild men called the Pukul Men, and they have a chieftain called Gon Bruigon who leads them through the secret passes of the forest in order to attack Mordor, because they apparently complained of being hunted by orcs and wanted the men of Rohan to help drive the orcs away. They're not in the movies. Sometimes they make it into like Lord of the Rings themed games, but not too many. Forge Warhammer. Some more men at arms to fight those nasty orcs. Caesar, circumvallation and contravallation. Yes, Alicia. Contravallation is when the walls face outward. So when the relief forces to Vercingetorix came to attack Caesar, they attacked the walls of contravallation. The walls of circumvallation surrounded Vercingetorix himself. Vingel, primal men who lived in the forest and wanted nothing to do with the wider world. Yeah, pretty much. And then Minoan based. Yeah. Let's see here. Youth in Asia sounds like what BAP was. Yeah, maybe. Maybe he should just join up with them. Forged Warhammer. I wonder how much Tolkien was influenced by Jules Verne or even Daniel Defoe. In what way? I've not read Defoe, but I have read Verne. So, and what do you mean by that? Minoan. Didn't Jules Verne write a book about Germans fighting with air balloons? I don't know. Maybe. Let's see. Youth in Asia, I think in the movie they just we're seen raiding villages. Vingel. The stone statues where Theoden and his troops stayed before going to Pelennor Fields were supposedly ancestors of the wild men. The Rohan called them Pukul men their stature. Vingel, I think the statues appear in the films. It's been a long time since I saw them. One does. It's in the extended edition. I think it's in the Return of the King. So, yeah. All right, everyone. That's the Siege of Gondor. Next week will be Pelennor Fields. Probably make for a bit longer episode. A lot goes on in that battle. And yeah, make sure other people know and tune in next week at same time, same hour. Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast signing off.